Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, so Carthage is 20 miles away from Nauvoo, Illinois. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram Smith, and along with John Taylor and William Richard, went to Carthage because they were charged. Well, the church was charged with civil disturbance, an act of civil disturbance. So they went there on their free accord with the promise from the governor that there will be no mob violence there. That did not happen. In the end, Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith both were killed. John Taylor was seriously wounded, and William Richard escaped unscathed. John Taylor was shot in the thigh, the knee, the arm, and he was shot in his chest, but his watch stopped it, and so he's
Really?
still alive. Yeah. Both the Smith brothers' bodies were buried in Nauvoo. That might have been mixed up in the
Okay,
books.
perfect.
And so, yeah.
How did Joseph Smith and Hiram die? Were they shot also?
Yeah, they were shot.
Okay, and my question is, so they go there with the idea that, you know, they're in trouble for civil disturbance. They go there on their own. The governor promises no violence. So did a mob come and just start shooting at these poor guys?
They stayed in the room of the jailer, in the Carthage jail. So
Okay.
they were upstairs, and so a mob came in, burst through the door and went upstairs. The four men were able to hold the door back so the mob couldn't go through the door. So then they started shooting through the door.
Oh, really?
And that's how John Taylor was shot, but once John Taylor was shot, he fell away from the door, and I believe it was opened finally, and Joseph Smith was shot, and he fell out of the upper window.
Really? And how about Hiram? Was he just dead on the floor there?
I believe so.
Okay, now how in the world did William Richard escape unscathed?
I'm not sure, but it's said that Joseph turned to William and said, "You're going to escape this unscathed, and you need to, so you can tell our stories."
Oh, really? Interesting. So a little prophet there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a great story. I did not know that. We will add that to the notes, and lucky students in AP1 will get the full story after Christmas. Okay? How about a nice hand? Yeah. Okay, that was great. I think you have potential, Andrew. Potential to become a wonderful history teacher after your mission. Hi, I'm Randy Dirk. Continue on here. All right, yesterday we got to, not quite through because I ran out of time. We're going to back up a little bit where I told you that the thousands of Americans that moved to California during the gold rush, they sold everything they owned, and they became known as 49ers because it was 1849. That's where the San Francisco 49ers got their name. They rushed to the gold fields of California. Many Americans forged the Great Plains and through the mountain passes with wagon trains. And I told you it took about 5 months to get from the eastern seaboard to the gold fields of California. Many of these trails along the route were lined with household goods that were thrown out of the wagons to lighten the load. There were dead bodies of animals that had passed away along the trail, also those that were harvested. You also could find graves of those pioneers moving west that were struck down either by Indians or disease or hunger, maybe thirst, cold, and heat. I think we finished yesterday by saying the first wave of 49ers would jam into lawless mining camps. We talked about vigilante law. There were no laws there, but yet somebody had to keep these people in control, so they kind of appointed vigilante officers that didn't really go through the, I'm going to arrest you, first I'm going to accuse you of something, I'm going to arrest you, I'm going to put you in jail, put you on trial, and then give you your sentence. It was kind of, we just pick you up, find you, and shoot you. There wasn't a lot of good justice. That's why it was called vigilante justice. Now, Were there some 49ers, this is kind of where we start today, were there some 49ers out there that found their riches beyond their wildest dreams? There were, but not that many. Most only found disappointment and soon gave up the search. Most only found disappointment. Have you kids ever watched the movie? It's a little off track here. Have you ever seen the movie Pale Rider with Clint Eastwood? Anybody ever seen that movie? Where he is really kind of a dead guy, and he comes back and he portrays himself as a preacher. And if you know Clint Eastwood, he doesn't play it. He's a tough guy, you know what I mean? Anyway, these poor people found, they were in this mining camp, mining gold in the mountains, and there was a guy that wanted them out of that land because he used sluice mining, where you sprayed water into the hills and just ruined the environment, but it would be an easier way to get the gold out. And these guys hung tough, and they wouldn't sell their deeds to their land, and it got to be kind of a hassle. But they were about to give up because they couldn't find any gold. And finally, one guy came across a great big nugget, and they kind of went into gold fever. And if you're interested in board over Christmas vacation, it's a good movie. It's called Pale Rider, and it's about this a little bit. Now, included in these 49ers that came west were Negroes. There were quite a few Negroes that moved west during this time to California. Some of these Negroes were slaves, and some of them were free. Okay? So, included in the wave of 49ers were Negroes, some free and some slave. Some worked as servants. Others searched for gold in crews under the direction of slave owners. So if you were a slave, you kind of had one or two jobs. You either were a servant for the people you went out with, or you worked the gold fields for your master, and he gained the profits. Okay? I don't know what kind of life that'd be, but that was one life they had. A few freed slaves became independent gold miners themselves. One in particular was a fellow by the name of Moses Rogers. Moses Rogers. He was an independent Negro miner. He was very, very good at what he did. He was born a slave in Missouri. Got his freedom. Moses Rogers. He was born a slave in Missouri, became an independent miner. He was so knowledgeable that many, many gold seekers went to him for advice. He became kind of an authority in mining. You want to know how to mine gold out here and have some success? Talk to Moses Rogers. And even though he was a Negro, many, many white gold seekers would seek out his advice on how to mine successfully and try to make a little bit of money. Well, if you think about this, when you have this uproar over gold, did every person that come there hand gold? What did some of the people go there to do?
Sell to them.
Well, you're close. Merchants. So a lot of people went there and they built stores in these mining camps and sold goods. How else could you make a little bit of money in these growing towns and eventually cities during this gold rush?
Restaurants.
Okay, restaurants. Very good. How about where people stay that don't have a place? Hotels. And even people went out there and built homes and then sold them to the miners. So my point is people started going out there to make money other than looking for gold. Went out there and started up stores. Went out there and started up restaurants, hotels. Some built homes, saloons. What? Tailors, very good, that sold clothing.
Trappers.
That's right, and could you not, Will makes a great point, if things are going good in that little town and everybody's finding pretty good gold, prices go up pretty good, you make good profits. The problem is, if it's not doing very good, you're not doing very good. That happened.
Doesn't that actually, when you find more, if the price drops? Slower it is.
Oh no, if you find more gold and people have more money, they're going to spend it. You know what I mean? If they're not finding any money, they're not going to spend it. That seems like you'd think the prices should go down. Why would they go down?
Because there's so much of it.
So much of what? So much of what?
Gold. Like
Well,
if there was a
that's,
lot of gold.
you think, now do you think if I won the $1.6 billion lottery that I'd quit spending money? God, I'd be sending all you kids to college and buying myself a new home on the Gallatin River by Bozeman and setting my kids up for life and you know, you guys would never have to, I'd buy the best uniforms possible for the speech and debate team and the drama team and the basketball team and the wrestling team and the music and pay for
That
all
money
their
would be gone
trips.
pretty quick if you did all that.
Well, yeah, but not, yeah, that's true. And that happens. Sometimes that's a problem. We'll talk about the Depression later in the 1920s. You know, the 1920s, everybody thinks it's the Depression. It was nobody had any money. Everybody had all kinds of money for a while. But they blew it all because they were making so much and put us into a depression. So it's a supply and demand thing, I get that. But in these particular mining camps, the more gold that was discovered, the more money was made in that particular camp. Well, this is kind of interesting because the people in California in late 1849 got together, and what did they draft? All these people got together of importance, so to speak, in California because of all these people coming in, and they drafted a what? Constitution. Very good. They drafted a constitution, and they had a vote on it in this California territory, and the settlers in California accepted this constitution. Once you develop that constitution, what's your next step? Well, laws and such, but once you get all that taken care of, what do you want to do?
Make some money.
You want to join the Union, okay? So late in 1849, a convention met, and a number of people drafted what we know as a state. Every state has a constitution, by the way. Wyoming has a state constitution. Drafted a state constitution. It was accepted by the people by vote, and Congress then looked at the possibility of bringing California into the Union. What's going to be the controversy? If it is it going to come in as a slave state or a free state? Who's going to determine whether it's a free state or slave state? The people that put together the what? Constitution. Well, it just so happened that the Constitution that was accepted by the people in late 1849 outlawed slavery in California. So when California was a territory, before it became a state, there you could not have slaves there. Now that was a benefit for them because when they went to look to put California into the Union, they were needing another free state to kind of keep this balance equal. So in what's that?
They were even there right then, though.
Well, we're kind of going back and forth, so I'm not sure on that exactly. We'll talk.
Iowa and Wisconsin.
Yeah, but we'll talk about that because we got to go. Like when we get in this lecture later, we got to go all the way back to the Compromise of 1820. So we're kind of going back and forth because of region and history. But I don't know exactly at this time. You could be right, but at this point, California was able to come in 1850 pretty easily because they wanted to come in as a free state, and that was going to balance. Okay. You want to really keep it balanced because otherwise, if you don't keep it balanced, people get mad. And that ends up being you end up being uncivil to each other, which generally leads to a civil war. We'll talk about that. All right. Any questions on California? Okay, last thing we'll talk about for this test material will be the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which hits pretty close to home here. The Treaty of Fort Laramie. Now we kind of prefaced this yesterday because as this endless stream of covered wagons and herds of cattle and people continue to cross the Great Plains towards California, they're going right through Indian territory, so to speak. Now, Indians weren't territorial. They didn't think they owned anything necessarily, but they had lands in which they used for their sacred burial grounds. And they had certain areas which were really good hunting for buffalo, which was a big part of their way of life. Okay? And so there were certain things. They were nomadic people. They moved from place to place. And they couldn't move anywhere without running into herds of settlers and herds of cattle with them moving westward, trampling over their sacred burial grounds, trampling over their buffalo hunting grounds, and disrupting the Native Americans' way of life. And we will get into this later in the year where we talk specifically about the Indians and their way of life. Now, what happens? What happens when white movement disrupts buffalo burial grounds and their freedom to move from place to place? They get mad. And what do? They start attacking these white settlers. Well, once that happens, the United States government's got to step in and protect their citizens against these Indian attacks. So they tried to do it by negotiation. So in the fall of 1851, the United States government invited the Indian leaders from the Great Plains to a conference to talk about this, to try to negotiate some way that white settlers could travel west without being harassed and killed by Native Americans. So instead of bringing in troops, which we'll talk about that later, they're going to try to do this by negotiation. So again, as the endless stream of covered wagons and great herds of cattle continued to cross the Great Plains towards California, Indians became very concerned. This movement by whites was disrupting their way of life, including their buffalo, their burial grounds, and their freedom to move. To meet this problem, the United States government invited the Indian leaders from all these different tribes that inhabited the Great Plains to a conference in the fall of 1851. Now, this conference is going to be held where? What? Come on, it's going to be held at Fort Laramie in what is now the state of Wyoming, down by Laramie, Wyoming. Still there. You can still go visit Fort Laramie. It's not exactly as it was then, but you can see it. It's on the historical site. Now, I think I have these all on your ID sheet, so just bear with me. There were 8 different Native American tribes represented at this conference. The Assiniboine, the Arikara, the Crows, the Gros-Ventres, the Shoshone, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Sioux. What's that? They're on your ID sheet. I'm not going to probably make you know them specifically, but I want you to know them. The point I want to make is that there are 8 different tribes that are represented. All on your ID sheet. Treat them as you wish. Yep. The Sioux, Assiniboine, Arikara, the Crow, the Gros-Ventres, although it's not spelt that way, Shoshone, Arapaho, and Cheyenne. They all had leaders from each of those tribes represented to meet with the American government. And again, in answering your question, we will not make you write all those names. Okay? But I want you to know. Now, what did the American delegation include? Government officials were there and army detachments. Why would they have army detachments there? Just in case. You can figure it out. Okay, they didn't go there with hostile means, but they went there because they didn't know what was going to happen. So these government officials met with army detachments, with these leaders of those 8 Indian tribes that were inhabiting the Great Plains. Somebody had to be the interpreter. Anybody know who that was? Jim Bridger, who was a very famous frontier scout, frontier guide, and frontier interpreter. So Jim Bridger, who Bridger, Montana is named after as you drive to Billings, was the scout and the guide who served as an interpreter at this meeting. And they met for several days. They kind of had your activity day we're talking about in December. They had games and celebrations and speeches, and they sat down and negotiated and conversed and tried to figure out a way peacefully they could solve this problem of white encroachment without retaliation by Native Americans. Well, they finally signed a treaty, which became known in history as the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The Treaty of Fort Laramie. We'll talk much more about this when we get into Native Americans later in the year. Now, in a treaty, it's kind of a quid pro quo. Anybody know what quid pro quo means? This for that. Okay, we're going to give them something and they're going to give us something in return, or vice versa. What do you think we want out of the deal? We want free passage of our white settlers westward to like California or Utah. In addition to that, we want the ability to build military forts along the trail to ensure, right, 2 things. That the settlers are safe, and that when the settlers get there in the winter and can't go any farther, they have a safe somewhat warm place to stay for the winter. So what we wanted out of the deal on the Treaty of Fort Laramie was the Indians to promise us safe passage for white settlers going through their lands to the west, namely California. We also wanted their permission to build selected forts along the way. And the purpose of those forts along those trails was for protection, and also that these settlers would have a place to stop, refresh themselves, etc., especially in case of winter where they could spend a long period of time. We have one of these forts, sort of, that we made. I may take you to visit that. We'll see how things go in the spring. Right down by Sheridan, by Story, Wyoming, called Fort Phil Kearny. Yeah, and that's a fort that was built as a result of this agreement we're talking about, that there's a history behind that we will talk about when we get into Native Americans. And if I feel like you guys are prepared and mature enough, we'll take a day out of school and we'll go down to Fort Phil Kearny and see it. It's pretty cool. Is there a fort there?
No.
No, there is no fort because the Cheyenne Indians burned it to the ground. But there's good history there. Yeah, this is what it looked like at one time, but now it's burnt to the ground. So when you go there, you don't see anything except for kind of semblances. And kids think, wow, that'll be boring, you're not going to see a fort. The cool thing is once you learn about the fort, you can picture what it looked like, and there's a model in there. And then we take you to a scene of what was called the Fetterman Fight, which was a massacre before the Custer Massacre. And it's a really interesting thing. We take the kids in AP. I've never had an AP class, but the kids really enjoy the trip. And if the weather's nice, we climb up on top of this really nice lookout called Pilot's Knob, in which they had sentries posted so they could see if settlers were coming and let them in. It's a really cool thing. And most kids in Wyoming don't have a clue that it's even there. Now, if we go, it will not be required. It will be something you can